In our headlines on this Wednesday, January 21st, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung holds his first press conference for the new year and pledges to promote peace on the Korean peninsula and prosperity within the national order. Meanwhile, the Seoul Central District Court sentences former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo to 23 years in prison on charges of insurrection under the former Yoon administration's short-lived martial law in December 2024. Over in the US, speaking to members of the media on Tuesday to mark the first year of his second term in office, President Donald Trump claims massive investment funds have been secured from South Korea and Japan to channel into an Alaska natural gas project. We start our newscast today with team coverage of the President's first press conference for this year. That being said, my colleague Yoon Jung-min starts us off with his remarks on restoring a tangible sense of security on the Korean peninsula. Do take a listen.
Restoring the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Agreement will be among the key agenda items for the Lee Jae-myung administration this year to ease tensions between the two Koreas and pursue peaceful coexistence. This was stated by the president during his New Year's press conference on Wednesday from the Blue House.
이 날선 냉랭함이 한 번에 녹지는 않겠지만 북측의 호응을 이끌어내고 한반도의 긴장 완화를 이룰 실현 가능한 조치를 일관되게 지속적으로 추진해 가겠습니다.
He reiterated his role as a pacemaker to facilitate talks between Pyongyang and Washington.
그 속에서 미국의 역할이 매우 중요하다고 생각이 돼요. 미국 트럼프 대통령이 약간 독특한 분이시긴 한데 그 점이 한반도 문제 해결에는 크게 도움이 될 수 있다고 생각됩니다.
When it comes to North Korea's increasing nuclear capabilities, Lee called his three-stage roadmap for denuclearization, which involves freezing, reducing, and dismantling the regime's nuclear program, realistic. On a possible U.S. tariff on semiconductors, President Lee said he was not too concerned, citing the Allies' joint fact sheet, stating that Korea will be treated no less favorable than its competitors. The Trump administration recently said it plans to place 100% import taxes on foreign-made chips.
대만과 대한민국의 시장 점유율이 8, 90% 이렇게 될 텐데 100% 관세 올리면 아마 미국의 반도체 물가가 100% 오르는 결과가 오지 않을까 싶어요.
The press conference came after Lee's trips to China and Japan at the start of the year. As to relations with Beijing and Tokyo, the president promised to manage risks that could unfold as conflicts and pursue cooperation for the economy and the future. The president will be fully in charge of state and foreign affairs as he's set to enter his second year in office, focusing on yielding tangible outcomes through his pragmatic diplomacy amid complicated conditions. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And beyond diplomacy, also covered in much detail during the press conference today was the economy as well as politics. Our top office correspondent Song Yu-jin reports.
President Lee Jae-myung's New Year's press conference was dominated by questions on the economy and domestic politics. The economy drew particular attention at a time when South Korea has persistently high house prices on the one hand and stock prices hitting fresh records on the other. To cool the housing market, President Lee hinted that his administration's third round of real estate measures is on the way, though he ruled out any plans to raise property holding taxes.
국토부에서 공급 확대 방안을 현실적인 공급 확대 방안을 발표할 겁니다. 근데 우리는 이제 그런 추상적 수치보다는 아주 구체적이고 현실적인 수치를 제시하려고 하죠.
When asked about the benchmark Kospi's rally now nearing his campaign pledge of 5,000, Lee said South Korean stocks remain undervalued. He cited the removal of political and security risks along with greater transparency in the market as key factors needed to further lift the index. President Lee also highlighted culture as the new engine for South Korea's economic growth.
한국의 문화, 한국의 음식, 한국의 감성 또는 한국의 풍경 이제 문화를 타고 이제 알려지면 그냥 한국 좋아, 한국 물건 좋아, 한국 스타일 좋아, 한국 음식 좋아 이렇게 되는 거예요.
Reaffirming the government's arm's-length principle of supporting the industry without interfering, Lee pledged additional financial support for the arts and cultural sector, calling this year's increased budget of 9.6 trillion won, roughly $6.5 billion, still insufficient. On domestic politics, President Lee made clear that his administration will push ahead with its plan to separate investigations and indictments into two agencies, one under the Interior Ministry and the other under the Justice Ministry, both set to be launched in October.
기소하기 위해서 수사를 하거나 수사를 합리화하기 위해서 기소해가지고 안 되는 거 알면서 가짜 증인 압박해가지고 유죄 만들고 이러면 안 되잖아요. 그럼 분리해야지 당연히.
However, Lee added that the government's proposal should not be seen as final, stressing the need to listen to political parties and the public to design a system that protects victims while preventing abuse of power. His comments follow divided opinions even within the ruling Democratic Party, including over whether prosecutors under the Justice Ministry's indictment body should have the authority to request supplementary investigations. Now, beyond these issues, President Lee also faces a long list of challenges, from local government integration and rising political polarization to a weakening currency. How he handles these tasks while pursuing unity and inclusive growth will be closely watched. 송유진, Arirang News.
Up next, we bring you the latest with regard to the trials against former members of the former Yoon Suk-yeol administration on charges of insurrection amid its imposition of martial law on December 3, 2024. The Seoul Central District Court earlier this morning announced its verdict against former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, and I have our political correspondent An Sung-jin standing by with details. Sung-jin, welcome. Should we start with the court's ruling, which I believe came this afternoon and not this morning, Sung-jin?
Right, Sunny. So let's first walk through what happened today. Now, the sentencing hearing began at 2 p.m. and the verdict was delivered at around 3 p.m. All while this was broadcast live, like the recent verdict in one related case involving former President Yoon Suk-yeol. The Seoul Central District Court sentenced former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo to 23 years in prison for aiding an insurrection.
The defendant is sentenced to 23 years in prison. The case concerning the use of a falsely prepared official document is dismissed.
This marks the judiciary's first ruling that states that the December 3rd martial law declaration constituted the crime of insurrection under the Criminal Act. 23 years is also 7 years more than what the special prosecution had requested. According to the ruling, Han's role as a prime minister vests him with democratic legitimacy and responsibility, yet he abandoned his constitutional duty to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. The bench also criticized him for choosing to participate as a member of the insurrection and noted that his actions could have pushed South Korea back into a dark era where fundamental rights and democracy were jeopardized, potentially trapping the country in a prolonged authoritarian regime and irreversible trauma and loss for the public. Following the verdict, the court conducted a separate hearing to determine whether Han should be taken into custody and ordered his immediate detention, citing concerns over the destruction of evidence.
Right. Sung-jin, also for the sake of our viewers who may not have been following this particular trial, do remind us about the accusations against former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo.
Right, so the ruling came 4 months after Han Duck-soo's trial began in September last year. The main charges against Han were assisting former President Yoon Suk-yeol in an insurrection and acting as a key participant. Prosecutors argued that Han neglected his duty as a prime minister to keep in check the president's arbitrary use of power. More specifically, the prosecution added that Han, as the second highest official in state affairs, was aware of such unconstitutional plans, yet aligned himself with the declaration by giving it the procedural appearance of having been reviewed by a quorum of the cabinet. Han is also accused of signing a revised martial law proclamation to remedy legal defects in the original declaration and subsequently ordering its disposal. This marks the first time in South Korea's constitutional history that a former prime minister has been taken into custody in a courtroom. The ruling is expected to have significant implications not only for the ongoing trial of former President Yoon on insurrection charges, but also for cases involving other former cabinet members. That's all I have on the latest verdict of former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo from today.
Seoul's finance ministry has disclosed a new support package for exporters big and small to ensure resilient growth. Our Kim Jun-hong has details.
South Korea's finance minister Koo Yoon-chul has announced plans to bolster export financing with a new policy-backed funding vehicle. Speaking at a meeting of economy-related ministers on Wednesday, the minister said the government plans to scale up its export financing capabilities.
We will increase financial support to spur new market development, extending coverage to long-term and lower credit projects beyond major defense, nuclear and industrial construction deals.
In particular, he announced plans to introduce a so-called Strategic Export Finance Fund designed to channel corporate gains back into strengthening the broader industrial ecosystem, adding that related legislation would be pushed through quickly. On shared growth between large and small firms, he said that the government will shift away from a big business-led model of economic diplomacy.
A shared growth strategy has been put in place to ensure large firms and small businesses advance together as equal partners, with export financing incentives offered for their joint overseas ventures.
Under existing rules, joint overseas expansion projects by large and small firms qualify for up to 1 billion won in funding over 3 years, which is roughly $680,000. The government plans to double that amount and also scale up support for investment projects in the United States. The minister underscored a renewed push this year to drive economic growth while addressing polarization through targeted policies. Kim Jun-hong, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, 4 major South Korean commercial banks have been found guilty of collusion and face an unprecedented fine of 272 billion won. Our Cho Young-eun explains.
The Korea Fair Trade Commission said Wednesday that it fined the country's 4 largest commercial banks, KB Kookmin, Shinhan, Hana, and Uri, a combined 272 billion won, or $183.7 million for colluding on real estate lending limits tied to loan-to-value ratios. Together, the 4 banks account for roughly 60% of South Korea's mortgage market. And the commission said their coordinated limits on LTV ratios significantly curtails consumers' ability to choose among lenders. The commission concluded that the banks coordinated real estate lending restrictions between 2022 and 2024 violated the Monopoly Regulation and Fair Trade Act.
The bank's combined related interest revenue was around 6.8 trillion won. The fine ranks among the largest ever imposed by the commission.
According to the KFTC, the 4 banks exchanged printed documents through Excel files containing LTV information in nearly 7,500 recorded cases. Data show that in 2023, the average LTV ratio offered by the 4 banks was 7.5 percentage points lower than that of non-colluding banks, and the gap widened to 8.8 percentage points for non-residential properties closely tied to corporate lending. The impact was particularly severe for small and mid-sized enterprises, which often have lower credit ratings and face greater difficulty receiving unsecured loans or additional collateral.
We believe that the biggest problem is that small and medium-sized enterprises and small business owners are facing difficulties because they are unable to secure the funding they need in light of the current economic conditions.
The case marks the first enforcement under a revised fair trade law that took effect in December 2021, which introduced a new provision banning collusion through the exchange of sensitive business information. Cho Young-eun, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., speaking to members of the media on Tuesday to mark the first year of his second term in office, President Donald Trump touted his trade policy, pointing to the investments secured from South Korea and Japan that he claimed would be funneled into an Alaska natural gas project. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump marked the first anniversary of his second-term inauguration on Tuesday with the White House news conference, highlighting his economic record and renewed America First push. Trump announced that large investment funds secured through trade deals with South Korea and Japan will be directed to an Alaska natural gas development project, calling the agreements unprecedented. He said the Alaska pipeline will export natural gas to Asian markets. Under the deal, South Korea agreed to invest $350 billion in the U.S. in exchange for lowering reciprocal tariffs from 25% to 15%. Of that amount, $150 billion will go to shipbuilding, while $200 billion will be allocated to energy, semiconductors, and artificial intelligence tied to national security. Japan pledged a separate $550 billion in investment. The Alaska LNG project, a key Trump initiative, involves a 1,300-kilometer pipeline from Alaska's North Slope, with initial costs estimated at $45 billion. During the news conference, Trump also touted his first-year accomplishments, dramatically tossing a stack of papers he said documented his record onto the floor before turning to inflation and criticizing the Biden administration's economic policies.
But here's the book. These are all things we have. I'm going to read a few of the samples, but look at this. These are all, each line is something that we did. Nobody did that before. And it's big stuff, too. Look, we have the hottest country in the world.
Trump also addressed ongoing legal uncertainty over his global tariffs, saying he does not know how the Supreme Court will rule, and acknowledged that the U.S. could be forced to repay hundreds of billions of dollars if it loses. He nonetheless defended the tariffs as essential for national security and federal revenue, insisting they have not fueled inflation.
I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. If we lose that case, it's possible we're going to have to do the best we can in paying it back. I don't know how that's going to be done very easily without hurting a lot of people. But we're waiting for that case anxiously.
The comments come as the Supreme Court has yet to rule on the tariff case, despite expectations that a decision could come as early as this week. In August, a federal appeals court ruled that Trump's use of the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act exceeded presidential authority, affirming a lower court's decision issued last May. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And the government here is planning an additional national medical licensing examination this year. The plan allows, that is, fourth-year medical students who returned to school last summer following dispute over enrollment expansion to qualify for licensure by August. Now, under this plan, some 1,800 students are expected to secure licenses to enter hospitals immediately. The Health Ministry says the rare supplementary examination will be held in spring and summer, with clinical skill testing running from March to April and a written test scheduled for July. Now, normally, the medical licensing examination is held once a year in the fall and winter. Authorities have granted conditional approval for BTS to film at major historic sites here in Seoul ahead of the group's comeback in March. The approval from the Korea Heritage Service covers Gyeongbokgung Palace and Sungnaemun Gate for use in a planned Gwanghwamun show. Now, Seoul City is in the process of reviewing a request by the group's agency HYBE for a show at Gwanghwamun Square as well as a separate event at Seoul Plaza. BTS is set to release its fifth full-length album titled Arirang on March 20th. Meanwhile, a newly added high-speed train on the Donghae line between Busan and Gangneung is raising much anticipation of greater tourism given the shorter travel time. Our Cha Yun-kyung reports.
A KTX train departing from Bujeon Station in Busan arrives at Gangneung Station. Since the 30th of last month, KTX trains with a top speed of 260 kilometers per hour have been operating on the Donghae line for the first time, running 3 round trips a day between Busan and Gangneung. The biggest change is travel time. The journey from Busan to Gangneung now takes about 3 hours and 50 minutes, which is 1 hour and 10 minutes shorter than the existing ITX Mount train service.
I fell asleep, and when I woke up, we were already almost there. I think I would use it again the next time I come to Gangneung.
Since its opening in January last year, the Donghae line has recorded more than 1.8 million cumulative passengers. With the introduction of the KTX service, up to 2,000 additional passengers per day can be accommodated, and annual ridership is expected to increase to around 2.8 million. Local governments along the East Coast have also prepared tailored strategies to ensure that the KTX service leads to a vitalization of tourism.
If you present your train ticket, You can use 10 attractions at the same discount rate as Samcheok residents.
However, due to limitations in track capacity, 7 out of 8 existing ITX train services have had their departure and arrival stations changed from Gangneung to Donghae Station, reducing travel options for passengers traveling to Gangneung. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport plans to review the possibility of increasing train services based on track capacity and passenger demand trends. Cha Yoon-kyung, Arirang News.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. U.S. President Donald Trump said the United States will very shortly begin targeting drugs entering the country by land, expanding his administration's anti-narcotics campaign. Trump told reporters on Tuesday that the move follows U.S. military strikes on suspected drug boats in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean, which he said has sharply reduced drug trafficking by water. He said land routes are now the focus, but did not name any country involved in the trafficking. Trump's remarks come as U.S. military forces seized a 7th oil tanker linked to Venezuela on Tuesday. The U.S. Justice Department has served 6 grand jury subpoenas to Minnesota state and local officials as part of an investigation into alleged obstruction of federal immigration enforcement. Those subpoenaed on Tuesday include Democratic Governor Tim Walz, the Attorney General, and the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Sources told the Associated Press the probe centers on public statements and possible violations of a federal conspiracy statute related to obstruction of immigration authorities. Minnesota officials called the investigation politically motivated, while federal attorneys said the state is improperly seeking to limit federal law enforcement powers. The subpoenas come amid weeks of unrest following an immigration crackdown. Iranian authorities have reportedly shut down 40,000 Starlink satellite internet terminals, tightening information controls following weeks of anti-government protests. That's according to German news outlet DPA, citing Iranian state media. Officials have not clarified whether the devices were physically seized or remotely deactivated, but the move comes despite earlier promises to gradually restore internet access. Iran is now reportedly pushing to permanently restrict global internet access to a small group of government-approved users, while the broader population remains confined to a state-controlled domestic network. Netflix has revised its takeover bid for Warner Bros. Discovery, offering an all-cash bid of $72 billion to secure shareholder approval and fend off a rival bid from Paramount. The revised deal released on Tuesday keeps the price at $27.75 per share, removes stock components, and aims to speed up a shareholder vote expected as early as April. Warner's board again backed Netflix's offer, while Paramount looks to legal action and a potential proxy fight. Analysts say whichever deal prevails will face intense antitrust scrutiny and a prolonged regulatory review. Chu Ji-hyun, Arirang News.
It got even colder today than yesterday. Cold wave warnings have expanded and intensified across the country. Seoul plunged to minus 12.2 degrees Celsius this morning, the coldest morning so far this winter. However, it will fall to minus 14 degrees tomorrow, setting a new record for the coldest day of this winter. Heavy snow is forecast in Chungcheongnam-do Province, the Jeollado provinces, Jeju Island, Ulleungdo and Dokdo starting today. In particular, areas under heavy snow advisories, including the southern west coast of Jeollabuk-do Province, the northwestern parts of Jeollanam-do Province, and the mountainous areas of Jeju Island could see 1 to 5 centimeters of snow per hour, so please take extra precautions. Chuncheon will start cold at minus 17 degrees tomorrow morning, with Daegu at minus 11 degrees. Daily highs will rise to -5 degrees in Seoul and Chuncheon, -2 degrees in Daejeon and Gyeongju. This cold spell will stick around for the time being. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That ends our newscast for now. As always, thank you for watching.